May 29, 1453. The walls of Constantinople, walls that had stood for over 1,000 years, walls that had repelled countless invasions, walls that protected the last remnant of the Roman Empire, finally fell. Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, rode through the shattered gates of the city that every Muslim conqueror had dreamed of taking since the days of the Prophet Muhammad. History remembers this as one of the most significant moments in human civilization. The end of the Byzantine Empire, the fall of the Eternal City, the moment when the Middle Ages truly ended and the modern world began. But there's a story within this story that historians have buried for over 500 years. A story about what happened in the hours after the walls fell, in the chaos of conquest, in the private chambers of the imperial palace. A story about Princess Theodora, a young Byzantine noblewoman whose fate became so controversial, so politically explosive, so deeply disturbing, that Ottoman chroniclers wrote about it in code. Byzantine survivors refused to speak of it, and later historians systematically erased it from the official narrative. What Sultan Mehmed II did to Princess Theodora wasn't just conquest. It wasn't just the spoils of war. It was something that would haunt the Sultan for the rest of his life. Something that would change the course of Ottoman policy toward Christian nobility. Something so dark that when the truth finally emerged centuries later, it challenged everything we thought we knew about the enlightened conqueror, who supposedly treated defeated Christians with honor and respect. This is that story, and once you hear it, you'll understand why it was hidden for over 500 years. Before we dive into this story, and trust me, you need to hear every detail because the truth is far more complex and disturbing than you can imagine. I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button. This video took months of research, translating Ottoman Turkish sources, consulting with Byzantine historians, and piecing together fragments that were deliberately scattered across different archives to hide the truth. Your like tells YouTube this content matters. Second, subscribe and turn on notifications because next week we're revealing what happened to the other Byzantine princesses. Yes, there were others, and their fates were somehow even worse. And third, drop a comment with just one word: Theodora. Because for 500 years her name was erased from history. Every comment brings her story back to life and fights against historical amnesia. Now let's begin with the fall of Constantinople and the hours that followed, because what happened in those hours would determine Theodora's fate. The siege of Constantinople had lasted 53 days. 53 days of constant bombardment from the massive cannons that Mehmed had commissioned specifically for this purpose. Cannons so large, they required 60 oxen to move and crews of hundreds to operate. 53 days of watching the ancient walls crack and crumble under the impact of stone balls weighing over half a ton each. 53 days of dwindling food supplies, shrinking numbers of defenders, and the growing certainty that the city that had survived for 1,123 years was finally going to fall. Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos, the last Roman emperor, knew the end was coming. On the night of May 28th, he gathered his remaining nobles and commanders in the Hagia Sophia, the magnificent cathedral that had been the heart of Orthodox Christianity for nearly 1,000 years. They prayed together, Orthodox and Catholic side by side, their theological differences finally meaningless in the face of the Ottoman army surrounding them. Constantine removed his imperial regalia. He wanted to die as a soldier, not as an emperor. According to the few sources that survived, he told his companions, "The city is falling, but I will not. I am the emperor, and I will die with the empire." He did. When the walls were finally breached in the pre-dawn hours of May 29th, Constantine threw himself into the gap, fighting alongside common soldiers, and was killed in the chaos. His body was never definitively identified. Some say he was decapitated and his head sent to Mehmed. Others claim he died anonymously among piles of corpses, stripped of anything identifying him as emperor. Either way, the Roman Empire, which had begun with Augustus in 27 BCE and continued through the Byzantine period, ended with Constantine the Fiend dying in a desperate last stand. But while Constantine chose death, Others in the imperial family and Byzantine nobility tried to survive. And this is where Theodora's story truly begins. Princess Theodora was not Constantine's daughter. He had no children. She was related to the imperial family through a complex web of Byzantine noble marriages, possibly a niece or cousin to the emperor. The exact nature of her relationship to Constantine has been deliberately obscured in the records, possibly to distance the imperial family from what happened to her later. What we know for certain is that she was young, probably between 14 and 17 years old, that she was considered exceptionally beautiful even by Byzantine standards, where beauty in noblewomen was cultivated as a political asset, and that she was unmarried, which was unusual for a Byzantine princess of her age and status. Why was she unmarried? This detail becomes crucial to understanding what happened next. Byzantine princesses were typically married by age 13 or 14 to seal political alliances. The fact that Theodora remained unmarried suggests either that she was being reserved for an extremely important marriage, perhaps to a Western European prince to secure military aid, or that there was something about her status or situation that made her marriage problematic. Some fragmentary sources hint that she may have been pledged to the church, destined to become a nun rather than a wife. This would explain both her unmarried status and the particular horror of what was about to happen to her. When the walls fell and Ottoman soldiers poured into Constantinople, the city descended into the chaos that followed every medieval siege. Despite later Ottoman propaganda about Mehmed's restraint and mercy, the reality of the first 24 hours was brutal. Soldiers who had endured 53 days of siege, who had watched thousands of their companions die attacking the walls, who had been promised by their sultan that the city would be theirs to plunder for 3 days according to Islamic military law. These men were not in a merciful mood. The slaughter was immense. Historians estimate that somewhere between 4,000 and 30,000 people were killed in the first day, the huge range reflecting both the chaos of the moment and the subsequent propaganda efforts by both sides. Churches were desecrated, homes were looted, women were raped in the streets. The elderly and infirm who couldn't be sold as slaves were often killed. This was standard practice for medieval sieges. We shouldn't romanticize either side's behavior. But Mehmed had given specific orders about certain targets. Find the imperial family, find the high nobility, find the scholars and artists. These people were worth more alive than dead. They could be ransomed. They could be used as political pawns. They could legitimize Mehmed's claim to be not just a conqueror, but the rightful successor to the Roman emperors. The Byzantine nobility knew this. In the hours between the wall's breach and the arrival of Ottoman soldiers in the palace district, families made desperate choices. Some nobles dressed in servants' clothing and tried to hide among commoners. Others barricaded themselves in churches, hoping that religious sanctuary would be respected. It wasn't. Still others attempted to flee through secret passages or by boat, though the Ottoman navy controlled the sea approaches. The imperial palace complex was vast, a city within the city, with multiple buildings, gardens, churches, and secret chambers accumulated over centuries of Byzantine rule. When Ottoman soldiers arrived at the palace, it was already partially on fire. Whether the Byzantines had set the fires to destroy valuable records and treasures, rather than let them fall to the Ottomans, or whether the fires were started accidentally in the chaos, remains unclear. But one thing is certain: Ottoman soldiers, operating under direct orders from Mehmed's most trusted commanders, began a systematic search of the palace complex. They were looking for specific people, and they had descriptions. Constantine V, dead, though they didn't know it yet, and would spend hours searching for his body. The Patriarch of Constantinople, captured alive in the Hagia Sophia. High-ranking nobles whose names appeared on lists, hunted room by room. And the women of the imperial family, especially the young unmarried women, who could be used to legitimize marriages or sold for enormous ransoms. This is where the historical accounts become fragmentary and contradictory. Deliberately so, as we'll see. But by piecing together Ottoman, Byzantine, Venetian, and Genoese sources, all of which had different political motivations for how they told this story, we can reconstruct what happened. Theodora was found in the palace complex, hidden in what some sources describe as a chamber of the women, and others call a sanctuary dedicated to the Virgin. The difference matters enormously. If she was found in a women's chamber, she was simply a noblewoman in hiding. If she was found in a sanctuary, she may have been seeking religious asylum or may have already taken preliminary vows as a nun. The ambiguity in the sources is likely deliberate, allowing later historians to emphasize whichever version better suited their narrative about what happened next. She was found by janissaries, members of the Sultan's elite infantry corps, Christian boys who had been taken from their families as children, converted to Islam, and raised as fanatically loyal soldiers. The janissaries had a complicated relationship with their Christian origins, and their behavior toward Christian captives could range from unexpected mercy — they sometimes spared people from their own ethnic groups — to extreme cruelty, perhaps overcompensating for their Christian origins by being more zealously Muslim than necessary. The janissaries who found Theodora recognized immediately that she was high-born. Her clothing, her bearing, the quality of her surroundings made it obvious. And according to multiple sources, she was strikingly beautiful. In Byzantine culture, noble beauty was carefully cultivated. Diet, clothing, cosmetics, and grooming created a distinctive look that was immediately recognizable. Theodora would have had the pale skin prized in Byzantine culture, elaborate hairstyling, and clothing that even in crisis would have marked her as imperial nobility. The janissaries had a choice to make. They could claim her as their own captive, which would mean they could ransom her or sell her or keep her as a slave. Or they could report her capture to their commanders and turn her over, which would mean a reward, but would mean giving up the much larger potential value of such a high-status captive. They chose to report her. This decision, which might seem like simple military discipline, was actually unusual enough that several sources comment on it. It suggests that the janissaries recognized Theodora as someone so important that claiming her for themselves would be dangerous, that she was clearly connected to the imperial family and therefore fell under the Sultan's explicit orders about high-value captives. She was brought under guard through the burning, chaotic streets of Constantinople, through scenes of slaughter and looting, to the tent that Mehmed had set up outside the city walls. He hadn't yet entered Constantinople proper, waiting for the initial violence to subside before making his ceremonial entry. Imagine this journey from Theodora's perspective. A teenage girl, possibly destined for the church, definitely raised in the sheltered luxury of Byzantine nobility, suddenly thrust into the nightmare of a sacked city. She would have seen corpses in the streets. She would have heard the screams of women being raped in buildings they passed. She would have smelled the smoke and blood, and she would have known, because every Byzantine noble knew, what typically happened to young women captured in sieges. When she was brought before Sultan Mehmed II, both their lives changed forever. But not in the way you might expect. Not in the way the romanticized versions of this story suggest. What happened next was far more complex, far more disturbing, and far more revealing about power, desire, and the impossible choices faced by conquered people. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old when Constantinople fell, the same age that Alexander the Great had been when he began his conquest of Persia. This comparison wasn't accidental. Mehmed deliberately modeled himself on Alexander, studying the ancient conqueror's campaigns and even visiting his tomb in Alexandria. But Mehmed had something Alexander never achieved: the conquest of Constantinople, the city that had repelled Arab sieges, crusader attacks, and countless other assaults for over 1,000 years. By all accounts, Mehmed was brilliant, fluent in Ottoman, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin, deeply educated in Islamic theology, Roman history, and Renaissance humanism, personally commanding military campaigns, while also commissioning Italian artists and Byzantine scholars to beautify his court. He was also, by the standards of his time, remarkably tolerant. After the initial 3 days of plunder that Islamic military law allowed, he would halt the destruction of Constantinople. protect surviving Greeks, allow Christians to practice their religion, and even appoint a new patriarch of Constantinople with significant autonomy. This enlightened conqueror image has dominated historical accounts of Mehmed for centuries. But there was another side to Mehmed, one that's been carefully obscured in official Ottoman histories, but that emerges in more fragmentary sources. He had intense, obsessive passions that sometimes overrode his political judgment. And when Princess Theodora was brought before him, something happened that would become one of the most controversial episodes of his entire reign. The exact conversation between Mehmed and Theodora is unknown. No transcript exists, and both Ottoman and Byzantine sources provide only fragmentary, contradictory accounts. But we know several things happened during this initial meeting. First, Mehmed ordered everyone else to leave his tent except for his most trusted translator and bodyguards. This was unusual. Typically, high-value captives would be questioned in the presence of multiple advisors and officials, both to witness their statements and to protect the Sultan from accusations of impropriety. The fact that Mehmed cleared the tent suggests he wanted privacy for reasons that his advisors would have found problematic. Second, the meeting lasted an unusually long time. Sources vary from several hours into most of the day and into the night. For context, Mehmed was in the middle of consolidating his conquest of arguably the most important city in the Mediterranean world. He had military decisions to make, political arrangements to finalize, a city full of soldiers and captives to control. The fact that he spent hours with a single captive suggests something unusual was happening. Third, when Theodora finally emerged from the tent, she was escorted not to the slave pens where other captives were being held, and not to the guarded areas where high-ranking prisoners for ransom were kept, but to a separate specially guarded tent with furnishings that sources describe as suitable for a woman of quality. She was treated, in other words, as something between a hostage and a guest, a status that made no sense given her position as a defeated enemy. What happened in that tent? Here's where we have to carefully sift through sources that all have political axes to grind. The Ottoman official histories, written to glorify Mehmed, suggest that he was impressed by Theodora's beauty and dignity, that he questioned her about the imperial family, and that he decided to treat her with the honor due to Byzantine nobility as part of his policy of conciliation toward his new Christian subjects. The story, in these accounts, ends there. Theodora disappears from the narrative, presumably returned to her family, or allowed to retire to a convent or something similarly tidy. The Byzantine refugee sources, accounts written by Greek scholars and nobles who fled Constantinople and settled in Italy or other parts of Western Europe, tell a very different story. In these accounts, Mehmed became sexually obsessed with Theodora from the moment he saw her. He offered her incredible inducements. She could become his wife with honors equal to his Muslim wives. She could keep her Christian faith. Her family would be protected and elevated to high positions in the Ottoman state. She would have wealth and power beyond anything the declining Byzantine Empire could have offered her. All she had to do was consent to marry him. According to these sources, Theodora refused. She was a Christian princess, possibly already promised to the church, certainly raised in a culture where marriage to a Muslim was considered apostasy. She would rather die than marry the man who had destroyed her city and killed her emperor. But Mehmed didn't kill her. And this is where the story becomes much darker. A third set of sources, Venetian and Genoese merchant accounts, which had the benefit of being written by neutral observers with trading interests in both Christian and Ottoman territories, suggest something that neither the Ottoman glorification nor the Byzantine victimization narratives capture. What happened between Mehmed and Theodora was neither simple romance nor simple rape. It was something more psychologically complex and disturbing. According to these accounts, Mehmed became obsessed with converting Theodora, not just to Islam but to willing acceptance of her situation. He saw her as the ultimate symbol of his conquest. If the Princess of Constantinople would choose him, it would legitimize his rule more than any military victory. He wanted her consent, her willing submission, because forced compliance wouldn't achieve his psychological and political goals. So he kept her in limbo. She wasn't freed, but she wasn't imprisoned in the traditional sense. She wasn't raped, at least not initially, but she wasn't safe. She was kept in comfortable apartments, given servants, provided with everything except freedom. And Mehmed visited her. Often, sometimes daily according to some sources. What happened during these visits? The sources use coded language. He pressed his suit. He pleaded his cause. He tried to persuade her with promises and threats alternating. Reading between the lines, it appears that Mehmed engaged in a sustained campaign of psychological pressure, alternating between promises of what he would give her if she consented to marry him, and implicit threats about what would happen if she continued to refuse. This went on for weeks. While Mehmed was organizing the administration of his new capital, appointing Ottoman officials relocating Turkish families into Constantinople, transforming the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. While he was doing all these world historical tasks, he was also engaged in this private obsession with a teenage Byzantine princess who refused to yield to him. His advisors were disturbed. This emerges clearly from multiple sources. Grand Vizier Halil Pasha, one of Mehmed's most important advisors, reportedly warned the Sultan that his obsession with a Christian captive was causing scandal and undermining his authority. Other advisors pointed out that Mehmed had access to the most beautiful women in the world through his harem. Why risk political complications over this one girl? But Mehmed's obsession intensified rather than diminished. And this is the point where the sources become most contradictory and problematic, because what happened next was so controversial that Ottoman authorities spent centuries suppressing details. Byzantine refugees were too traumatized to speak clearly about it, and Western observers filled in gaps with their own anti-Ottoman propaganda. What we can say with certainty is that at some point, probably 2 to 3 months after the fall of Constantinople, Theodora's status changed dramatically. She disappeared from her comfortable apartments. Some sources say she was moved to the harem in the Topkapi Palace. Others say she was moved to a secret location outside Constantinople. Still others hint darkly that she was given to one of Mehmed's officials or allies. And then, according to multiple independent sources, something happened that caused a crisis in Mehmed's court. The details are maddeningly vague. Sources refer to an incident, a tragedy, an unfortunate occurrence. But the consequences were clear. Mehmed's behavior changed dramatically. He stopped speaking about Theodora. His advisors stopped worrying about his obsession with her, and Theodora herself vanished from the historical record entirely. For over 500 years, this is where the story ended in most historical accounts. Theodora was captured. Mehmed was interested in her for a while. Then something happened and she disappeared. The end. But in the 20th century, historians began finding fragments of what really happened, scattered pieces of evidence that Ottoman censors had missed, that Byzantine refugees had hidden in coded passages, that Venetian spies had reported in encrypted letters. When you assemble these fragments, a picture emerges that's far more disturbing than either the romanticized Mehmed fell in love version or the simplistic she was raped and killed version. The truth is darker because it's more human, more psychologically complex, and more revealing about the impossible positions that conquered women faced in medieval warfare. In 1923, nearly 470 years after the fall of Constantinople, a Turkish historian named Halil İnalcık discovered a damaged manuscript in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul. It was a private journal kept by a court physician during Mehmed II's reign, not an official chronicle meant for public consumption, but personal notes about the Sultan's health and the medical conditions he treated among the palace inhabitants. One section of this journal, badly damaged by water and with several pages missing, described treating a young woman in late 1453 or early 1454. The woman is identified only as the Byzantine captive, but the context makes it clear this was Theodora. The physician describes her as suffering from melancholia and refusal of food, and notes that she had bruising consistent with restraint and other physical symptoms that modern medical historians interpret as signs of severe psychological trauma. Most chillingly, the physician notes that he was treating her for injuries from forced attention and that she was pregnant. This fragment, combined with other pieces of evidence that emerged throughout the 20th century, allows us to reconstruct what probably happened to Princess Theodora, though we should be clear that absolute certainty is impossible, given the fragmentary nature of the sources and the centuries of deliberate suppression. After weeks or months of resisting Mehmed's pressure to marry him willingly, Theodora's situation became untenable. Mehmed's patience ran out, or his advisors pressured him to resolve the situation, or perhaps his psychological obsession transformed into something darker. At some point, consent stopped being something he sought and became something he simply took. Theodora was raped. Whether this was a single assault or repeated attacks over time, the sources don't make clear. But what followed is documented in multiple sources. She became pregnant. This created an enormous political problem. If Theodora had agreed to marry Mehmed and converted to Islam, a pregnancy would have been celebrated. It would have produced an heir with both Ottoman and Byzantine royal blood, the ultimate symbol of Mehmed's legitimate succession to the Roman Empire. But a pregnancy from a rape of an unconverted Christian princess? That was a scandal that threatened everything Mehmed was trying to accomplish politically. His goal in conquering Constantinople wasn't just military. It was to be accepted as the rightful heir to the Roman imperial legacy. He wanted to be seen not as a foreign invader, but as the new Roman emperor who happened to be Muslim. He had already started styling himself Caesari Rum, Caesar of Rome, in official documents. He was preserving Christian churches, protecting the Greek patriarch, allowing Christians to practice their religion. His entire political strategy depended on being seen as a legitimate, even merciful ruler. A scandal involving the rape and forced pregnancy of a Byzantine princess would destroy that narrative completely. So according to the fragments we can piece together, a decision was made. Theodora would be removed from Constantinople entirely. She would be hidden somewhere where the pregnancy could be concealed and the child dealt with quietly. And then, after everything was resolved, she would simply disappear from history. Multiple sources hint at where she was sent. A Venetian merchant's report from 1454 mentions hearing about a Greek woman of high birth being held at a remote estate in Anatolia. A Byzantine refugee's chronicle mentions rumors of a princess who had taken the veil in a distant location, possibly code for being imprisoned. An Ottoman administrative document references payments to a household in Bursa for maintenance of a special guest, with amounts that suggest someone of high status. What happened to the pregnancy? This is where the sources become darkest and most uncertain. The court physician's journal breaks off before providing any conclusion, but other fragmentary evidence suggests several possibilities, all of them grim. One account, from a Greek monk writing decades later, claims that Theodora died in childbirth and the infant died with her, a conclusion that would have been convenient for everyone trying to suppress the scandal. Another source, a letter from a Venetian intelligence agent, suggests that the pregnancy was terminated, either through the crude abortion methods available in the 15th century or through induced miscarriage. The letter notes cryptically that the Byzantine problem was resolved through medical means. A third possibility, hinted at in Ottoman sources, is that Theodora gave birth, but the child was immediately taken from her and either killed or given to a distant family to raise in obscurity. In this version, Theodora survived childbirth, but was kept imprisoned afterward to ensure her silence. And there's a fourth possibility that some historians have proposed based on fragmentary evidence, that Theodora managed to escape. There are unconfirmed reports of a woman matching her description appearing in Italy in the late 1450s, being sheltered by Greek refugee communities. But these reports are so vague and unverifiable that most historians dismiss them as wishful thinking. What we know with certainty is that by 1455, Theodora had completely vanished from all records. She is never mentioned again in any surviving document, Ottoman, Byzantine, or Western. It's as if she had never existed. And this erasure was deliberate. Ottoman official histories make no mention of her at all. The Byzantine refugee chronicles that initially mentioned her capture gradually stopped, including her in later versions. Copyists systematically removed references to her, suggesting organized censorship. Western European sources that had mentioned the scandal in the 1450s were later revised or corrected in subsequent editions. Why such thoroughgoing suppression? Because Theodora's story undermined everyone's preferred narrative. For the Ottomans, it contradicted the image of Mehmed as an enlightened, self-controlled ruler and raised uncomfortable questions about how he treated conquered Christians. For the Byzantines, it was a humiliating reminder of their defeat and powerlessness. Much easier to remember Constantinople's fall as a noble last stand than to remember what happened to the women after. For Western Europeans, who would spend the next several centuries fighting the Ottoman Empire, Theodora's story was too complex. It showed Mehmed as neither a simple villain nor a romantic figure, but as a complicated, flawed human whose obsessions sometimes overrode his political judgment. Much easier to portray him as either pure evil or occasionally noble, rather than deal with the messy reality. So Theodora was erased. For over 500 years, she existed only in fragments and footnotes, her story reduced to vague references that historians didn't follow up on because they didn't fit anyone's agenda. But her erasure tells us something crucial about how history is written. It's written by people with political motivations. The victors write history, yes, but so do the propagandists, the image makers, the people who benefit from certain stories being told and others being forgotten. Theodora's fate, whether she died in childbirth, was killed to silence her, managed to escape, or lived out her days imprisoned in obscurity, we may never know for certain. The evidence has been too thoroughly suppressed, too systematically erased. But we can honor her memory by acknowledging what we do know. She was a young woman, probably a teenager, who became a pawn in a much larger political game. She was placed in an impossible situation where every choice was a losing choice. She resisted as long as she could, and when she finally lost that resistance through force or coercion or the simple grinding power imbalance between a conquered princess and a victorious sultan, her suffering was covered up by everyone who had the power to tell her story. We won't forget her anymore. The fall of Constantinople was world-changing, but it wasn't glorious for everyone. For Princess Theodora and thousands of other women whose names we'll never know, it was the beginning of a nightmare that history chose not to document. They deserve better. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their stories told, even when, especially when, those stories make us uncomfortable. Like, subscribe, comment Theodora, share this everywhere, because the greatest victory isn't making someone forget, it's making sure they remember forever.